once you hear this and you like what you hear, you can follow me. I started a YouTube channel with some of these lectures, all surrounding substance use disorder, the substance use disorder arena. I'm on Facebook, Dr. David A. Douglas. I'm on LinkedIn. My son talked me into it. I just got on TikTok, which is, kind of fun, but I try to keep it simple. So Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube channel. Wow, isn't that crazy? And now TikTok. I know. So follow me if you would. There's lot more great info besides what you'll get today. Let's do it, Pam.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today for a substance use disorder training on the history of the war on drugs presented by Dr. David Douglas. Just a little history. David has been a member of Kittitas Valley community for nearly 20 years. Professionally, David teaches at CWU and recently completed his doctoral degree where he has done research and work creating trainings to teach about substance use disorders. David is a person in long-term recovery from a substance use disorder. He brings a unique perspective to the trainings he provides as having lived experience in accessing multiple systems along the way to recovery. Today's training is focused on the failed history of the drug war and how it has failed individuals, families, and whole communities. With David's engaging and enthusiastic energy he brings to his trainings, I'm sure you will all find this event very informative. Again, thank you for attending, and please welcome Dr. David Douglas.
Thank you, Pam. I was saying previous to starting this, I literally just had to go for a walk with the girls, our dogs, because I'm really excited to present this material to you. It's been a while since I've done this lecture, so I'm really, really excited to do this. And I want everyone to know that my goal when I do these type of lectures and all of the work I do in the community is, number one, all about helping people find a pathway to recovery from substance use disorders. And almost hand in hand with that, it's all about lowering stigma for this health condition. And I say that on purpose. As I go through my talk, you'll understand why. So I usually do this in a room, but you can just kind of think for yourself, or you can raise your hand if you know how to do that, or you can even just say yes. I want to ask, how many in our virtual room here have been affected in any way, shape, or form, whether it's you directly, a family member, people you work with, by substance use disorders? Got a thumbs up there. I got hand clapping, thumbs up. Yeah, and if I were to go through, let me go through. Yeah, I see the thumbs up. Thank you. Usually when I do this in the room, it doesn't take too long for hands to go up. This is a very, very important issue that affects really everyone in a community. I always like to say that substance use disorders are a family disease. So it's always important to keep in mind it doesn't just affect the individual, it affects the whole family, it affects communities, and it affects society as a whole. So I want to just paint a picture real quick before I jump into the slides, and I promise I only have a handful of slides. It's really just talking points and information for you to pull from as I go through this. What I want to talk about is the reality, and even more so, and this is not any treatment provider or healthcare provider's fault, right? We're in a pandemic, but paint this picture pre and post pandemic. This is the reality. And it's the story of today's access to treatment for a person who develops a substance use disorder. And the reason that it is the way it is, as I described this scenario to you, which is very real, is because of the policies that have been put in place by federal and state governments over the last, really, I have 50 to 60 years in my notes, but it's longer than that. I'm going to update my slides for a future presentation because I just learned, I'm kind of a history buff now and learning about the drug war, that the drug war actually started sooner than I thought it did. I have information that it started during the Nixon administration, but really it started sooner than that. So here's the story. Here's the reality, is that and if an individual in our community who has a substance use disorder, and I want to I want to say this. You're going to hear me talk about this issue in a real different way than what you might be used to, because I'm all about lowering stigma, and part of lowering stigma is changing the language we use to discuss this very important issue. So you won't hear me even, addiction isn't so bad, but you won't even hear me use that. You're going to hear me use the word substance use disorder a lot. You're going to hear me use what's called person-centered language. So I just want to give you that caveat as we go through this. Now, if an individual in our community is struggling with a substance use disorder, and many people with substance use disorders to keep their addiction going, commit what we term, and the data supports, are low-level nonviolent crimes, right? Most people, the vast majority, 80 to 90% of people with substance use disorders who do commit crimes, they're not rapists, murderers, anything like that. These are low-level nonviolent crimes, and one of the most common crimes is they'll steal, right? Shoplifting, which is wrong, which is something that people should be held accountable for. But to tell you this story, if they go to our local Fred Meyer and they steal an item, and it's, say, a high-ticket item, right, because it needs to be in order for an officer to come and give a citation and then go, oh, man, yep, you're going to jail. The story I want to tell you is that that person in that scenario will get instant access to resources. And when I say resources, I'm talking about taxpayer-funded resources, meaning a law enforcement officer is going to show up. They're paid a pretty good wage, as they should be. Then if they take them to the jail, that's a very, very expensive taxpayer-funded resource. And then they'll go to jail and they'll stay there however long. They'll get access, of course, instant access to our judicial system, right, through the courts. And all of that will happen almost immediately in most scenarios, especially for people with substance use disorders who have repeatedly, right, done these type of low-level nonviolent crimes. They almost always get instant access to resources, right? So follow me here. Now, let's say that same individual with a substance use disorder who, prior to having a substance use disorder, never committed crimes, right? Prior to using heavier drugs, right? So a lot of people, and I don't say all, but most people who use lower level drugs, marijuana, you generally don't see people smoking just marijuana who commit crimes per se. Most people who just drink alcohol, and I say most because DUIs and deaths due to alcohol are huge. Anyone in the medical industry knows that. But generally, we start seeing these low-level nonviolent crimes committed with heavier drug use to feed that addiction, right? Okay, so I gave you that example, how they're going to get instant access to resources. Now I want to flip the script. Let's say that same individual recognizes through some type of crisis, through family talking to them, through a healthcare provider talking to them, hey, you need help. If you get help, you can turn this around. Here's what happens in all too many cases. So they say, all right, I'm going to go down to my local treatment provider and I'm going to ask for help. Remember how I just described how they get instant access to resources through the judicial system, but the second they recognize, they say, hey, I need help, all of a sudden that wheel stops spinning and the barriers to access to treatment kick in. Number one, if they don't have insurance, which in many cases they don't. If they don't have insurance or cash money for treatment, they get put on a wait list, right, for government funding treatment because we have a lack of access to beds. We call them beds for treatment, and so they'll get put on a wait list. They might get an assessment, which we're doing good things in our community. We really are. But the reality is they might get an assessment that day. They might very well get assessed as having a substance use disorder at a level that they need inpatient treatment. And they won't get that treatment because of lack of resources, because of lack of access. They might get handed a stack of paperwork and told, hey, fill out all this paperwork, and we got you on this wait list. Now go home, and we'll call you. And I chuckle to bring a little humor to this scenario because it's not really humorous. But what is that individual going to do who has an active substance use disorder while they're waiting for treatment? That wheel with the judicial system, with the instant access to resources, guess what? That one's always going to be there. And I'm going to tell you the story of how this has happened in our society for this health condition that has been treated through the judicial system time and time again. So, a little bit about me. Who am I? My name is Dr. D, affectionately called. I teach at Central Washington University. I say in my day job, I love working on campus. I love teaching. I actually just finished my doctoral process right at the beginning of the pandemic. March 9th, I got my email from my chair of my committee that said, boom, you're done. So I became Dr. D. I am not a medical physician, but I'm all about education. I have a doctor of education in educational leadership and management, and all of my research, both in my master's work and in my doctoral work, is in this arena. My eyes were opened wide when I really started looking at this very important issue through a different lens, and that's through the research. I work in the community outside of Central through doing this type of work through Communication Pathways, my small business, giving lectures just like this. I also have a contract. I just had a meeting today with the Alternative High School, Excel, myself and someone that works with me, of course, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, but we're hoping to get back in virtually. We teach students on life skills and feathering in for those students who have substance use disorders. I'm very excited. I put it in my notes. And if you're writing down, if you're just listening and you have a pen and pencil or you're typing, this coming Monday, watch Ellensburg City Council, 7 p.m. Monday. It's live streamed on ECTV. You can look this up. I'm very excited for a program that's going to be rolled out that is in this arena. I can't really let out the secret yet, but it's coming. So I'm highly involved in the community. And again, at the beginning, like I said, I'm all about helping people find a path to recovery. So, I like to let everyone know that I am a very proud and awesome person in long-term recovery myself because of access to resources, right? And I've faced many barriers along the way that I've managed to get through in some way, shape, or form. But I'm also long-term in recovery. Because of access to resources, I haven't used any substances in any way, shape, or form outside of coffee, right, or sugar. But drug uses, alcohol, it's all been done for me since March 25th of 2007. And I like to add, because it's an awesome thing, we're a family in recovery. My wife's a person in long-term recovery. My son's a long-term person in long-term recovery. And I have other family members. So I always like to say, this is one of my catchphrases, recovery works, lives change. So what are we going to cover? I'm going to cover how it began, how the drug war began, what was happening before, because there were some really cool things happening before the drug war. And you're going to get the picture of its effect on families, the effect of the drug war on communities, specifically when the drug war started, African American communities, minorities, low-income families, and you've probably heard the term mass incarceration, the drug war. That's what began and has continued to fuel what we know as mass incarceration. And then I'm going to close it up because I like to close things up on a positive note. I like to start on a positive note, get that real information out there. And I'm going to talk about recent years and changes in policies and what I hope for the future. Oh, and if you have questions about anything that I'm talking about, you can throw it in the chat. We may not have time to cover it all, but I want you to ask me questions. I have my email available. All of that to say, I'll answer your questions. If we don't have time in this presentation, I'm more than happy to dialogue with you. So what I want to talk about is prior to the drug war. And when I say prior to the drug war, I'm going way back. It's a little historical lesson. What I'm going to talk about is the 40s to the 60s. There were actually some really positive movements going at a federal level, and then it was filtering out to the states in this arena to help, number one, lower the stigma regarding substance use disorders. And there were some really amazing policies being enacted to help people find a path to recovery. Because here's what happened prior to the 40s. If an individual had a drug or alcohol problem, you may or may not know this, they were sent to an insane asylum. That's the old school name for a mental health facility. That's what happened. But people in key positions and people who were willing to be a voice for this as being a health condition started saying, no, we need to treat this as the medical condition it is. You guys know this. I have many in the healthcare community I know in here. The American Medical Association added alcoholism as a medical condition in 1952. So again, prior to that, the medical and even though it was identified as an actual medically diagnosable condition, many even in the medical community did not grasp onto that and go, "Yay, yes, this it to this day, but definitely back then was treated as a moral issue, a moral failing, and you just needed to make better choices or you just needed to pray that it would get better." It was not viewed as the medical condition it is. So there was some really cool stuff going on. A lady named Marty Mann, she spearheaded efforts, and it actually created the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence. Really cool stuff going on there. She spoke in front of Congress. She was doing really good work to create new and effective ways to help people with alcoholism. And again, we're talking in the 40s and 60s. A man named Senator Hughes was one of the first leaders to publicly say he struggled with alcoholism and he found help through, his doctor and through talking to people doing these things. And this was unheard of, right? So at this time, also the 40s to the 60s, there were actors and actresses going in front of Congress and saying, yeah, we need to really look at this differently. Even the founder, I'm sure many in this room have heard of the programs of Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, all the anonymous programs. And there's some misconceptions about the term anonymity, right? Me as a person in recovery, I speak loudly about being a person in recovery. Even Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, went in front of Congress and testified and said, yes, this needs to be treated differently. So that gives you a little bit of a picture of the cool things that were happening in those early days where it was actually being treated like a health condition. Okay? Now, things changed. And again, this is about a 45-minute presentation. So there's a lot more to this. It's a lot deeper, but I just like to give you a taste on purpose so that you go out and learn more and engage with me more as someone who has knowledge. There are a lot of people that have great knowledge in this arena and can help you understand. It was the Nixon administration and that did the formal announcement, and you can watch it on YouTube. You can just do a Google search for Nixon's administration declaring drugs. He did his famous speech, enemy number one. That was the kicker. And this was in 1969. And this really formally began, formally meaning they started funneling millions, back in 1969, probably millions would be billions in today's world, into the drug war. Okay? So it was implemented also, and check this out, read the history on this. It blew me away. I was like, oh my gosh. This was also during the height of the civil rights movement. So the data supports this, and it shows this, that the drug war was actually disguised as another way to quell the efforts being made of the civil rights movement. Many communities targeted by law enforcement, told to by federal and state local officials, African American communities, minorities, low-income communities. These were the targets of those early days, and still in many ways to this day, of the drug war. And to paint this picture, we know, right, everyone in this room knows that substance use disorders affect everyone. They don't just affect one community or one socioeconomic status. That's not the case. So that's when it began, and to this day, it's still being fueled. I always like to say this is not a political deal, right? There have been positive efforts in different administrations, but every administration since the drug war has continued to fund and fuel that drug war machine, right? I'm hopeful that we will now start to see some positive movement away from the drug war, because many administrations have done these rubber stamp things saying, yes, we need criminal justice reform. Yes, we need to help people with substance use disorders. They make these proclamations, but they don't put any funding behind it. So I'm hopeful that we'll start to see some change over the next few years. Oh, and because this is a beautiful thing, this is not a partisan issue. And both for conservatives and liberals who are on both sides of the aisle, this is the one issue now in the year 2020 that they will work together, because they see the negative effects of doing the same old thing is not working. And we need to treat this like a health condition so that we can actually help people. So the DEA, everyone's heard of the DEA? That's when it was created. The Drug Enforcement Agency and other agencies with the federal government were created during this time period to fight this war on drug. And this is one of the things I like to say, and I'm stealing this from someone else, another leader in this arena, and I don't remember exactly who it was, but this is the truth. The drug war has never been a war on drugs. It's always been a war on communities. Oh, geez, there it is. The war on drugs is a war on communities. I put it in my slide by Holly Neer. This is a war on humans, right? That's what it's always been. To this day, I should actually calculate it. There's a great, the drugpolicy.org organization. They keep track of the spending on the drug war. If you look at this just from a fiscal standpoint, it's been a massive waste of tax dollars, because the goal was to do what? To get drugs off the streets. Nobody can argue with that, right? Man, it'd be great if we can get, we have the same amount, if not more, drugs on the streets today than we did in 1969 when the drug war began, whose whole intent was to get drugs off the street. So it's been a massive failure just from a fiscal standpoint, but a human standpoint, it's ruined families. Countless families, I'm reading directly off the bottom of this slide, countless families have suffered due to the long-term effects of incarceration, due to the war on drugs being that war on humans, not a war on drugs. So that's when it began, right? Millions and billions of dollars were fueled toward the drug war, and it was all about, if we just arrest people and hold them accountable, you know, the whole intent and what we were hearing was, you know, we got to get drug dealers, blah, blah, blah. But and still to this day, we're not having an effect with that mindset. Most of the arrests that are made, even to this day, and it's starting to change in some communities, are those low-level, non-violent drug users who in many cases are painted as drug dealers. But if you really look, they're just people with substance use disorders, just dealing small amounts. And again, that needs to stop. But they need treatment. And if we get treatment, get them to turn it around, all of that stops. It goes away. So the 80s marked a huge, massive ramping up of the drug war. I'm 53 years old, and I was in the military, and I went in the military in 1984. I remember the crack epidemic beginning and then just fueling into the late 80s. And that's when we really started, if you know, the show Cops. Yeah, watch that show differently now, and you'll really see the drug war in place and where they were going to fight the drug war. But we saw a ramping up of the drug war due to the crack epidemic. Leaders from the president on down were like, we need to keep fighting this war. And they kept funneling billions of dollars into the drug war. Oh, I need to go back. What I think you've already understood that the painting the picture of during these early days, the 40s to 60s, there was positive movement, healthy movement toward treating this like the health condition it is, and the criminal justice issue it is not. So that meant funding was going toward research in this area. Funding was going toward treatment. It stopped. It just trickled, like 5% of the budget. I don't know that for sure, but it just trickled. The funding was going toward arresting our way out of this problem. And it continued here. And this is when we all started to learn the term mass incarceration. We, as a modern society, imprison more people per capita than any other society in the world. Any other. And don't believe me on this. Look up the data at who we're locking up, right? Many people are locked up. And during this time, oh man, when I started reading about this and learning about it, I'm like, oh my gosh. mandatory sentencing laws were put in place by the federal government and state governments that tied the hands of judges, the judicial system. And here's what would happen. I like to tell stories because people can really grasp onto stories. What does that mean? And why did it really escalate the just ripping apart of families across our nation? Mostly minority, low-income families. So if I, a white male in an affluent community, this is what was happening, and I think some of these laws have been overturned, and many states are going, yeah, no, this is not, it's not equitable, it's not fair. But if I, a white male in an affluent community, had a baggie of powder cocaine, right? Say a half an ounce, that's a lot, right? And I got caught with that. How I would be treated in the judicial system would be much different than if I lived in a low-income community, right? And I got caught with, because that's the target, the law enforcement were not targeting affluent communities because we don't have problems there. If they were targeting the low-income communities, which they were, and they would arrest an individual with, say, 3 rocks, and I say rocks, that's the slang term for crack cocaine, say 3 or 4 in individual baggies, which they believe that person was dealing, which they might be. That amount of cocaine compared to the individual over here who has a baggie of cocaine is crazy in comparison. Just crazy. This person would get the mandatory sentencing law, the draconian laws that would literally almost give that individual a life sentence. This guy over here, because he had access to an attorney that he could hire, he or she, they were affluent, they were viewed differently, they could literally get probation. This person, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. 20 years in prison. And many people got life sentences, right? Draconian laws were put in place, and this is where mass incarceration became a reality. And we could not build prisons fast enough. Again, all due to the drug war. So we were starting to hear these terms, drug war, and started seeing the effects of these draconian laws put in place. Again, tying the hands of prosecutors and judges who could see, man, no, this person, they need treatment, they need help, but they couldn't even make the judgment, right, that they were hired to do because of draconian laws. They dramatically affected, highly proportionate, directly toward low-income African-American minority communities. They were the communities that were affected in many more cases than affluent communities and white communities. So we started seeing this, though, during this period. We couldn't do anything about it because the federal and state governments were fueling this drug war. But by this point, billions of dollars were being funneled toward this on a regular basis. This was during the Bush 1, Clinton, and Bush 2 administrations. And this is where both sides, right? Many people think that one side or the other is more either a proponent of the drug war or a proponent of, treating it like a health condition. All administrations to this day have continued to fuel the failed drug war. Now, I'm doing good on time. So we're going to have time for questions. This is good. Again, I know I've said this a couple times. This is a very in-depth topic that I'm giving you maybe for the very first time in about a 40-minute window. So please do your own research and look up. And what I like to do with this is if it gets you a little angry, that's okay, because if that shifts you into action, into changing how you talk about and approach this health condition, that's gold. So read about it, learn about it, research it, and then affect change. Now, what we started to see in the 90s, because listen, as a person who in recovery myself, who's used drugs at levels that would make your skin crawl, who's been in situations, I've been literally on the streets of Tacoma. I'm going to show you my before and after picture, who is a professional now in this field, who's worked as a counselor, what I want you to fully understand is that recovery does work and lives do change. And if we can all change how we look at this and really go toward my next slide, which is titled Toward a Healthcare Approach, man, we're going to make amazing change. Okay? So there's a quote on the top. It says, "I believe that the war on drugs is a tragically misplaced use of resources." And I agree with that. "An immoral venture that produces more suffering than it alleviates." Right now, if I'm boring you a little bit just looking at me on the screen or the slides, go Google incarceration rates in the United States of America and the why, right? It's massive, massively caused more suffering for families than it's done any good at all. Now, we started to see studies started to begin to prove what many already knew, right? But couldn't really say because we didn't have the data. You could see it, but by that's what I was going to say. It's right now we're in the opioid epidemic, right? In the 90s, it was the meth epidemic. In the 80s, it was the crack epidemic. That's why I appreciate that there's lots of funding coming down for grants to support helping people with opioid disorders. But what we need to be doing is just funding all substance use disorder treatment, recovery, support. It's kind of, I say, the drug of the week, right? Drugs have always been part of society. And when we just focus on one and we say this is part of the stigmatizing, well, if you had an opioid disorder, I could get you treatment right now. It's like, what? No. So we need to step away from that. In the 90s, because jails were just packed full, we couldn't fill prisons fast enough. The backlog for judicial systems in the Tacoma, Seattle, which is originally where I'm from, in New York, in big metropolitan areas, I'm sure even in Kittitas County during this time, the backlogs were crazy. They were just overwhelmed. So we started seeing the need to look at this differently. So drug courts began to form. Now, I'm a proponent of drug courts to a point, and we can talk about that in another talk. But they did form, and it's a good thing during the meth epidemic because the lawyers, prosecutors, judges, all of these, even people in the law enforcement, right now today, this is very true, law enforcement leaders, officials who've spent any time in the field go, yeah, we're not going to arrest our way out of this problem. So drug courts began to form. And that was a good thing. What drug courts do is they say, okay, Johnny, you have a charge for drug possession and low-level nonviolent crime, whatever the crime is. So if you go to treatment, we're going to provide resources, good. And if you do all the right things, we will not give you that charge, which is life-changing. When you have a criminal record, you face many barriers, even for people in recovery, but we'll wipe that away. So a good thing. But if Johnny trips a little bit and doesn't do recovery exactly how he's supposed to do it, which is very normal, right? You can trip and fall. If you get back up and keep going, good. You need more treatment, yes, good. Then they would give him that felony charge, which sticks with them forever. So drug courts began to form. A good thing, needs some adapting, but mostly good. Even leaders in law enforcement by the 90s were just going, yeah, this isn't working. Wow, the same people that probably 20 years before had the mindset, no, we need to arrest those drug users. We need to get them off the street. It's the only way we're going to get drugs off the street. By this time, they're like, no, not working. With this repetitive cycle, recidivism rates were just skyrocketing, just crazy, right? And in many areas still are. The federal government finally, right, started to go back to the 40s and 60s. Meaning they started to look at this as, okay, yeah, no, this is not a criminal justice issue. This is a healthcare issue, and we need to treat it like the healthcare issue it is and not about the criminal justice issue that we've been treating it as. So, toward a healthcare approach, yay! As I've already described, even those who were directly working toward fueling the drug war, we're going, yeah, okay, you know what? We want a seat at the table, and we want to start looking at this in a different way. By the end of the 90s, a shift really began to happen to address the years-long damage of the drug war. Okay? Now, this is important to understand and a strong part of my work. By this point, though, there was a massive, massive amount of stigma attached to addiction, right? Massive amount of stigma attached to it because there was a lot of fear about if I say I need help, how am I looked at, right? Because of shows like Cops, who, you know what? I used to watch Cops. I did. I don't watch it anymore because it really fuels stigma for our people who need help, not be shown on a screen at their worst time in their life, right? But we started to see a shift. Recovery advocates like myself, started speaking loudly about the need for change in this arena, right? We had politicians, stars, musicians saying, you know what, I'm in recovery and we need to look at this differently. And then this is what happens, right? When we scream loud enough, we, the citizens, policy starts to begin to shift. Laws start to begin to change. And the stigma attached to it started to begin to be addressed through changing policy, through changing how we look at people with substance use disorder. And I'm almost done. My last slide has some links for you, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. We are worth the effort. And I'm just being honest with you, I get chills. We are worth the effort. What you see on the screen in front of you is my before and after. I'm all about being a forward-thinking person, living my life today and what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't spend a lot of time in the past, but I use my past in situations like this when it can help educate people and really tell people that recovery works and lives do change. I'm going to reach down. It just so happens I'm in my home office, and I have, because I've started doing talks on this, this is my history, right? In this are journals. In this I have one file of my previous life when I was in active addiction, when I had an active substance use disorder, and I went through the system, the judicial system. I was in and out of jail. Many would look at that picture on the left, and I know many did, and went, lost cause. Never going to make it. But I'm living proof that when we, leaders in the community, medical providers, law enforcement officials, all across the spectrum, when we look at this differently and we provide resources, if it takes once, twice, or 3 times in treatment, let's do it. If it takes helping a person retraining for job training, let's do it. If it takes looking at someone with a criminal record, which personally, I had a criminal record until 2010. I was able to go back to the courts and vacate my record. And I don't mind sharing that with you because I can tell you the stigma attached to someone like myself who had years of recovery, who had never committed a crime in my life in recovery, but yet that history stayed with me until 2010, right? If we can look at people differently, and when it comes to housing and employment, again, I'm living proof. My son's living proof. And I hope that some of you know people in recovery because we have many of them in our community that when we provide access to resources, and sometimes again and again and again, over the continued access to the drug war that has proven to fail, we get results like myself and many others. It is my goal to educate in this arena and help people to understand how history has hurt us in this arena, but how we, you, medical providers, professionals working in whatever field you're in, can shift the narrative. On the screen, and I'm going to open it up to question, there are some links to some great researchers that I used as part of my master's and doctoral programs. There's some leaders who are recovery advocates who speak loudly about this. I encourage everyone to watch the films that I listed. The Anonymous People. It really talks a little bit about what I talked about. It gives real stories and the effects of the drug war. Generation Found, that's focused specifically on youth and recovery high schools. Oh man, it's a beautiful film. And then The American Drug War, The Last White Hope. It talks in depth about some of the things I touched on. There's some websites there that you can go to. And now what I want to do is open it up. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. and I want to open it up to any questions you might have.